All right, Mr. Ahmed here for 5.7. This is the last section in Chapter 7, and it involves using congruent triangles. So our essential question today is, how can I use congruent triangles? Now, this kind of goes back to when we started discussing what congruent triangles were. Keep in mind, we said that triangles have 6 parts. They have 3 sides and they have 3 angles. Now, when we were proving they're congruent, we only really needed to show 3 things. We showed side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, etc. Now, that only involves showing that 3 things were congruent in the triangle. So really, once we know that the triangles are congruent, we know that all of their corresponding parts are congruent. So it just gives us more information after we've shown they're congruent. So our last theorem for the chapter is what we call CPCTC, and it just says if 2 triangles are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. So that stands for CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So what we are going to do is we are going to show that some triangles are congruent using our side, side angle shortcuts, and then we can state that some different parts are congruent other than the ones that we already used. So our first example, this is what it's going to look like in big ideas. It says, explain how we could prove that angle A is congruent to angle D. So when I look at the diagram, angle A and D are not currently marked as congruent, so I don't know that yet. However, I can assume the reflexive property that this BC is congruent to itself. This was already marked, this was already marked, there were 2 ticks here and 2 ticks here in case you couldn't see. So now I could state that the triangles are congruent by side, 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 and I have to name the triangle correctly. So ABC, angle A would correspond with D, so we'd have to go DBC. And then we could state that angle A is congruent to angle D because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, which is CPCTC. Okay, so first 2-column proof. We are going to prove that angle S is congruent to angle W. So I am told in the given that triangle SUT is congruent to triangle, that's big capital T, WUV. That is given. Statements, reasons. So since these triangles are congruent, we're supposed to show that angle S is congruent to angle W, which indeed it has to be because these triangles are congruent and those are corresponding parts. So for step 2, I could say angle S is indeed congruent to angle W because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so that was an easy 2-stepper. The next ones we're going to do are a little bit more challenging. And in order for us to show that something is a midpoint, I need to show, for me to state that U is the midpoint of TV, I have to have 2 congruent segments. So somewhere along the lines, I am going to have to state that TU is congruent to UV. Now, this one, it appears as if we made a slight error on the problem because that's just too easy based off the given, but we're going to roll with it anyway. I am told that the triangles are congruent. I need to prove that. So, step 1, statements, reasons. So, triangle SUT is congruent to triangle WUV. That is given. So, since I have the congruent triangles, that means that UT has to be congruent to UV, which it's marked like that, but the reason why wasn't based off of a given, it was based off of the congruent triangles. So I need to state I'm using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, so I know that TU is congruent to UV. And now, since those 2 parts are congruent, now based off the definition of midpoint, we can indeed state that U is the midpoint. So I get to finish. U is the midpoint of TV. And the reason is the definition of a midpoint because it was cutting the segment into 2 congruent parts. Okay. Another fairly straightforward one. I'm told that the triangles are congruent. So statements, reasons, given triangle AEB is congruent to triangle CED, given Since that's the case, is CD congruent to AB? So let's see, CD is the first and last, AB is the first and last. So yes, those are corresponding parts. So step 2, we can say they're congruent. And the reason is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, now the bisect one. So for us to have a bisector, for CA to bisect DB, DB needs to be cut in half. So for DB to be cut in half, DE has to be congruent to EB. Once we state that, we can state that it's a bisector. So let's see if we can prove that. Step 1. I am told that the triangles are congruent. AEB is congruent to triangle CED. So we have 2 congruent triangles given. Now, are these the corresponding parts? Does DE correspond with BE? Yes, it does. DE, EB, we can state those segments are congruent. So DE is congruent to EB. Reason? We used our corresponding parts. The statement. Corresponding parts, congruent triangles are congruent. So since these 2 segments are congruent, now I can say that it is a bisector. So step 3, CA bisects DB. And my reason is the definition of a segment bisector. So all of these problems, the triangles were already congruent. And the parallel lines, again, I'm told that the triangles are congruent. So statements, reasons, step 1, given triangle STV is congruent to triangle UVT, given ST parallel to VU. So for these 2 lines to be parallel, alternate interior angles need to be congruent. So I need to trace that Z. So here is the Z. ST was parallel to VU. So the Z is right here. These 2 alternate interior angles need to be congruent. Here's our Z. So angle STV needs to be congruent to UVT. Let's see if those are corresponding parts. Angle STV, yep. UVT, yep. We used our corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now, since those 2 angles are congruent, I can say that ST is indeed parallel to VU. And my reason is the converse of alternate interior angles theorem. If the alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So on the assignment, like we said, you're going to see quite a few where you're more making a plan. You're not going to have to do quite as many 2-column proofs as I did. You're going to need to fill in the blanks. Make sure that you can state that the triangles are congruent, reason why, and then you're going to use corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So that's it for chapter 5. Have a great rest of the day.